Okay, I'm going to go through the steps here. I'm not going to use the 4-step process the book mentions. I'm going to give kind of a 5-step process that'll work for this kind of problem and also all the way through chapters 17 and 18. So the first thing you want to do in a null hypothesis test is set up what your null hypothesis and alternative hypotheses are. So we have all these reading times, and the null hypothesis would be that it takes just as long to read Gigi font as it does whatever their base Times New Roman, I think it was, and that would be 22 seconds. So if there's no difference between how long it takes to read Times New Roman and Gigi, then the average reading time for Gigi should be 22 seconds. So we could write that as mu equals 22. And then their alternative hypothesis is, does Gigi take longer to read? So they're specifically, what word did they use there? They said, is there good evidence that the mean reading time for Gigi is greater than 22 seconds? So that greater than is the trigger that this is a one-tailed test, that this is a alternative hypothesis where mu is greater than 22 seconds. If they would have said, is there evidence that it takes a different amount of time to read Gigi than Times New Roman, we would have had mu not equal to 22. If it would have been, is there evidence that Gigi is quicker to read than Times New Roman, it would have been mu less than 22. So that alternative hypothesis, there's really 3 different ways it could go. And this would be a one-sided, because we're only interested in seeing whether this Gigi reading times are more than 22 seconds on average. So that's step 1. Step 2 is setting up your alpha significance level. And then you could also determine the critical Z here. So for a 0.05 one-sided alternative, we would look up 0.05 on table A, and that should give us about a z-score of 1.64, 1.65. So in other words, if we end up getting a z-stat of higher than 1.645, we're going to reject. To get the sample mean, really you need to average these. That's the simple calculation I was referring to. You'd have to add all these numbers from the book and then divide by 25, since there's 25 of them. Here, since I'm using a spreadsheet, I can just use the average function. The population standard deviation sigma is given to us. Sample size is 25. So to calculate that z test statistic, we're just using this formula right here. So we know our sample mean was what we just calculated. This right here stands for the null hypothesis mean. So this would be that 22 seconds. Standard deviation was 6 divided by square root of 25. So you work that in and end up getting a z test statistic of 4.24. And then to get the p-value, you need to look up this 4.24 on table A, and what you would notice is table A only goes up to 3.49. But we can see a pattern here. Notice as we get further and further, higher and higher z-scores, notice what's happening to the portion of the graph that's to the left of us. You can see it's slowly going up higher and higher, and this trend would continue. So as you get up towards 4, this is going to be 0.9999. The main point here is your p-value, which is the area in the tail, it's the area to the right in this case, would be 0.0002, and as we go up higher, it's just going to get less and less, 0.0001, and so on. So even though you can't get an exact p-value without using technology, you can see that it's certainly going to be less than that 0.05, which is our cutoff to reject the null hypothesis. Here I was able to use technology to get the more precise p-value, but even if you could just see that it is going to be less than 0.05, you can say we're going to reject that null hypothesis. So what was that null hypothesis? What is it that we're rejecting? What do we have evidence against here? We're saying we have evidence that it's not the same amount of time to read Gigi font as to read Times New Roman font. We're rejecting the idea that it takes the same amount of time to read Gigi font as it does to read Times New Roman. And then as we reject that null, we're essentially settling on the alternative hypothesis, which in this case would be that it takes longer to read Gigi font than Times New Roman, or it's going to take an average time that's longer than 22 seconds for reading these paragraphs written in Gigi font.